So our next topic of discussion is working with multi-step equations. And so this is where our equations get more difficult because there's just more to keep up with. But it's all based on the same basic steps that we have previously learned. So let's review with the following equation. Go ahead and give this equation a try and let's see how you do. First, you need to change all subtraction to addition and all division to multiplication, which we don't have, so we don't have to worry about it. In the next step, we want to have all of our variables on the left-hand side, and we want to have all of our constants on the right-hand side. So what we're going to be doing is getting rid of the variables that are on the right-hand side and getting rid of the constants that are on the left-hand side. The way we get rid of them is using our inverse properties, and since what we're dealing with right now is addition, we're adding variables and constants on the left side, we're adding variables and constants on the right side. Since we're dealing with addition, we're going to work with the additive inverse property, which is the opposite property. So I always start, well, I don't always, but a lot of times I'll start with getting rid of the constant on the left-hand side first. It doesn't really matter. You can get rid of that -5 first, or you can get rid of that -m first. But I'll typically start with getting rid of the -5. So I'm going to add the opposite, which is what? 5, right? I'm adding 5 to the entire left-hand side. However, I line it up under like terms since that's all it can really be added to. The same thing for the right-hand side. I'm adding 5 to that entire side, but I'll line it up under my like terms as 6. So now I'm going to simplify. When I simplify, the -5 and the +5 cancel. I'm left with -2m on the left side, and on the right side, the 6 and 5 add to equal 11, so I'm left with -m plus 11. Now notice I wrote it as -1m. Again, you don't need to write it as -1m. Eventually you'll just write that as -m. However, again, I'm going to use it to help you think through the steps. Now, I want to get rid of that -1m. So the way I get rid of that -1m is I'm going to add the opposite. Since I'm adding it to 11, I need to be working with my additive inverse. So what's the opposite of -1m? +1m, or positive m. So again, we can write this as +m or +1m. It doesn't matter. If it helps you to understand things this year, you can keep the 1 and the -1 in front of the m. Otherwise, you don't need to. So on the right-hand side, -2 plus, there's an understood +1 here, equals -1m, or -m. -1m plus 1m, those cancel each other to equal 0, and we're left with 11 on the right-hand side. So what do you do when you have a -m or -1m? Well, we have to multiply by the reciprocal, and we learned that the reciprocal of -1 is -1 because -1 times -1 equals +1, and that's what we're trying to get there, is a +1. If we multiply the left times -1, we have to multiply the right times -1 to keep our equation balanced. So we're left with m equals -11 as our answer. So let's review what we've learned to be our basic steps. Always change subtraction to addition and division to multiplication before you get started. Then simplify both sides by adding like terms. Then you work with adding the opposite to undo any addition, any terms that are being added to each other. And then you multiply by the reciprocal when you have just a number and a variable left. So a step where students get confused often is they want to multiply right here to get rid of that 1m. You can't multiply there because it's being added to the 11. As long as you have any addition left, you still keep adding the opposite. The only time that you're going to multiply is when all you have left is multiplying times a variable. That's the only time you multiply. Now in this problem, we're going to be applying the distributive property to all the steps we've been working with, along with some decimals. So as a quick reminder, what would you do with this 2.5, or -2.5? You distribute it, right? You're going to have to multiply that times everything within the parentheses. Go ahead and try the first couple steps where you change subtraction to addition and then you distribute. Try those two steps and let's see how you do. So in these steps, I am first of all starting out by changing subtraction to addition everywhere that I had subtraction. Next, I'm going to use my distributive property and multiply that negative 2.5 times everything within parentheses. So I get negative 2.5 times 2y plus negative 2.5 times negative 4. Now I'm going to simplify this right-hand side by using my order of operations, which will tell me to multiply first and then add. Negative 2.5 times 2y equals negative 5y, and negative 2.5 times negative 4 equals 10. Now you can skip the step right here if you're comfortable going straight from seeing the distribution step down to the answer to distributing. That's fine with me. It's completely up to you if you want to write that in between step. At this point, go ahead and solve this equation. I end up with y equals 8 as my final answer, and here are my steps. Let's move on to this next equation where we'll be applying the distributive property. So in this equation, after you change subtraction to addition, you'll need to distribute. So remember to distribute to everything within your parentheses, and this negative outside the parentheses, you're going to distribute throughout the parentheses as well. And you can treat that as a negative 1 or as an opposite, however you like to think about it with distribution. So go ahead and give this a try. So to start off here, we use our distributive property once we change subtraction to addition. And once I distribute, I end up with this step. Negative 2x plus 6 equals negative x plus 4. So this is the basic equation for solving. I'm going to add negative 6 to both sides, and once I do that, the 6 and the negative 6 cancel, and I'm left with 2x. Negative 2x equals negative x plus negative 2. So now I want to get rid of the negative x, and I do that by adding a positive x, and you can write it as negative 1x and positive 1x. That's fine. So I'm going to add x to both sides so that my negative x will cancel, and I'm left with only constants on the right side, only variables on the left. I end up with negative x equaling negative 2, and I need to multiply that by the reciprocal of negative 1 because there's an understood negative 1 beside my x. So when I do, I end up with positive x equals positive 2. Here are my steps. Go ahead and try this next problem. So in the first step, I'm going to change subtraction to addition, and in the second step, I distribute by multiplying a half times b, a half times negative 6, 3 times b, and 3 times negative 6. In my next step, I'm going to completely finish my distribution. 1/2 b is 1/2 b. A half times negative 6 is negative 3, and I could cross cancel there. And then 3b plus 3 times negative 6 is negative 18. I'm going to get rid of the adding of the negative 3 by adding the opposite, which is positive 3. I'm going to add 3 to both sides, and I end up with 1/2 b on the left because my 3's canceled, equals 3b plus negative 15 when I add negative 18 plus 3 on the right. Then I want to get rid of my b's, my variables on the left, so I'm going to add the opposite to get rid of them, and I add them to both sides, and I end up with negative 2.5 b on the left and negative 15 on the right. I need to change negative 2.5 to negative 5 halves so that I can multiply by the reciprocal, which is negative 2/5. I'm going to cross cancel here to keep my math nice and easy. Negative 3 times negative 2 is 6, and my answer is negative 6. Here are all my steps for this problem. I want to give you a couple of tips. First of all, our order of operations is parentheses, then we have multiplication, and then we have subtraction here. We can't do it in parentheses because we can't subtract, unlike signs. We can multiply using the distribution property, and we can subtract, but which one do you do first? you multiply first. Okay, so that's really one of those things that kids will get mixed up. They'll try to do 4 minus 1/2 first. You can't do that first. You're going to have to complete your distributive property first, and the same goes for the right-hand side. So go ahead and give this one a shot. My first step was to change subtraction to addition. Then I distributed, and you can skip down to this next step with distribution if you'd like. So here's my completed distribution once I went through and multiplied first, and after I multiplied, then I could add my like terms in my next step. So here I'm going to add my like terms, and that gives me a nice basic equation to work with. So now I want to get rid of the 7 on the left hand side, so I'm going to add the opposite of 7, which is -7, to both sides, and that cancels out my 7's on the left, so I'm left with just variables, and I simplify the right to get 6. So I'm left with -2x equals -3x plus 6. Now I want to get rid of that -3x on the right side so that I'll have just constants over there. So I'm going to add +3x, and those will cancel, and I have to add it to the left side as well. So I end up with -2x plus 3x, which is 1x or x, and on the right side is 6, and that's my answer. I'm going to have you try this next problem. Make sure you change this division to multiplication, and of course change all subtraction to addition, and use your distributive property and your order of operations. Good luck! So your first step should be changing all subtraction to addition and changing that m divided by 3 into 1/3 m. The next step is the distribution step, where you multiply 2/3 times m, 2/3 times -1/2, bring down your +3, and bring down the equals the 1/3 m plus the -7. Your next step, you complete the distribution. So we end up with 2/3 m. For 2/3 times -1/2, hopefully you cross-canceled and you end up with -1/3. Bring your +3 down and the equals in the other side down. In the next step, you simplify by adding your like terms. So you have -1/3 and 3 that you need to add together on the right-hand side. So you end up with 2/3 m plus 2 2/3 equals 1/3 m plus -7. We're going to add the opposite of 2 2/3 to both sides in order to get rid of the 2 2/3. And we're left with 2/3 m equals 1/3 m plus -9 2/3 when you add the -7 and the -2 2/3. Now we're going to get rid of the 1/3 m on the right, so we're going to add the opposite to both sides. And when we do, the 1/3s cancel to give us constants on the right and variables on the left. And we're left with 1/3 m on the left equals -9 2/3. We need to change that -9 2/3 into an improper fraction so that we can work with multiplication. So we end up with -29/3. Now we're going to multiply by the reciprocal on both sides, cross-canceling. These 3's on the right hand side cross-cancel out, and we're left with m equals -29.